Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the workshop, which is debating the Netherlands. I asked on debating series posting whether people wanted things covered, and someone asked me to make a video where I just go a bit wide over a lot of things about the Netherlands, just so that you have a comprehensive idea of what the Netherlands is and how to characterize this. So I will say this: I'm of course one person who's doing this from one specific perspective. I have researched all the topics that I've done here, but I think the main thing when it comes to something as complex as describing a nation or an economy or that kind of stuff is that people will focus on different aspects, will have different explanations of where problems may lie or where things might be true or might be important and that kind of stuff. So I would say take this as a starting off point. I will say on multiple times where things get complex and where you should do your own research if you want to get more detail. But I think I'm going to give you a basic overview, some basic characteristics that you can definitely use in debates that are touching on the topic at hand. And also, I hope, a general context that will make you understand just what the Netherlands is and gives you a feeling of it so it becomes intuitive. I'll cover a lot of bases, which is the following. Just the Netherlands at a glance. We'll just talk a bit about stereotypes, about maybe some perspectives that you might already have of the Netherlands. I'm going to shortly talk about Dutch politics. I won't go to too much depth because I already have multiple videos on this. I have one of them which goes into details about the specific problems in the Netherlands and talk about how different political parties stand to them that I did before Rotterdam pre-EDC. There is a video that just talks about the basics of Dutch politics, so the parliament, the chamber, and that kind of stuff. Again, if you want more details on that, watch that video. And I have videos on the specific parties that are important. And I think every party basically is covered in the Netherlands. So any questions that you have about policies, specific parties, why they exist, how they are important, all that kind of stuff is also already there. I won't go into depth here. I will just mainly focus on some issues and maybe expand on issues that I haven't covered in those videos. Then I'm just going to talk about the monarchy and the royal family as a whole. I'm going to talk about geography, which also again might overlap slightly with a video that I already did, which is about Dutch politics and geography and how this influences. So I won't rehash some of the information that I have there. I'll just try to add new information. If you want a bit more depth about, again, which specific region does which specific things, you should watch that video and like also understand the politics of this. But I also go into other aspects. So I think a bit of the economy, a bit about the culture and that kind of stuff. Then I'll talk about religion in the Netherlands. I'll talk about the economy, the energy sector in the Netherlands, because we had gas, and also because of the fact that we're going through an energy transition, which leads to a lot of interesting issues. I'll talk about the welfare state. I'll talk about culture. And then lastly, I'll talk about drugs, because I think this is also quite topical for the Netherlands. Now, for the first slide, I'll talk about Netherlands at a glance. I want you to think about what are aspects you might associate with the Netherlands. It's going to be light. Here are some things. We have, of course, if you look at the top left, we have windmills. We use that to get water out of our land. We have a lot of water. We're beneath sea land. We have like shallow pools of water. We have lakes. We want to have that removed so we can have more agricultural land or we can build there. That's what you use windmills for. That's what's called poldering. And that's what we care about. And also, you can, of course, use these windmills to, uh, you know, basically go from grain and kind of like rough it up to make something that you use for bakeries. Like you can grind it up using wood mill. Another thing, of course, is the tulips. We are very well known for them. I love picturesque pictures within the Netherlands with tulips. We're also a big export of them. Um, they're really, they were really, really important export that we had historically. It made us a lot of money. And that's maybe just the picturesque picture that you have of the Netherlands. Other important things are, of course, also beer. We are not a wine country or a strong liquor country. We're a beer country. We have some big brands. So, for example, Heineken. But we also actually have good beer. So, if you are in the Netherlands for Euros, which I hope you are, try some Hertog try some Amstel, try some Gols, try some other Dutch brands that we have. I think they're quite good. I think they're up there with, I think, good German and good Belgian beers. So, give them a try. We also have like our own IPAs and our own local brands and breweries that we have. So definitely try them out. I think they're also very interesting and they taste nice. We also care a lot about football. This is the Dutch national team. We went quite far this World Cup. We got to the out rounds, which is pretty good. And then we got knocked out by Morocco, which actually isn't a shame because Morocco is a really good team. And they were above us in the international ranking. But of course, a bit shame because you want to go further, you want to go to win it all or at least get in the final. But sadly, that's not the case. Well, then talk about Dutch food. So the Netherlands has maybe not a cuisine like the French or the Italians is like well known for its taste, But we have quite some pragmatic food. So we have a lot of fried food, which is just quite nice, quite dense. Definitely try something like called croquette and frikandellen in Dutch, which is a very specific thing. Another thing is that we are big on sandwiches, very pragmatic. You can travel with them, you can eat them a lot when you are working or when you're biking. So this is a very big culture. So we actually eat breakfast, which oftentimes used to be sandwiches, and then we also eat sandwiches for lunch, and then for dinner we just have a hot meal. The fact that there are countries where you have two hot meals for food is just to me ridiculous. It is again, maybe, we have the Protestantism, we have the Calvinism, we have the idea of maybe not spend too much money and being showing all the kind of stuff. Maybe that's also a part that plays into this. But like, just be normal, eat sandwiches, don't be so fancy. And then when you do have dinner, we have, the typical Dutch food is things something like hutspot, which is potatoes with some kind of vegetable in them. So this can be kale here, this is carrots, and you basically stamp them together. Again, very pragmatic, comes from our farmer background where we just have easy food. You just have potatoes, you have vegetables, you put them together, you're able to make a lot of food for a lot of people in the family, and then it has a lot of calories. It's hard, just going to keep you very filled up while you're working on the farmland. And that's where it originally came from. And of course, we also have things like herring. Because we're a big fishing country, we're on the sea, we like fish, and that's Dutch food. What I would recommend is trying this, or what I think is generally the best cuisine that we ever invented, which is called a kapsalon, which is great for drunk food. It is fries with cheese, like grilled cheese, with doner, and then also some salad, so like lettuce, tomatoes, cucumber, and onions, and then garlic sauce and sambal sauce if you like it spicy. Generally, one of the best hearty foods that you could eat after a night out. So when you had a long social or you didn't break a break night and you're very sad and you just want to drink and eat your sorrows away, go to like a local doner or kebab shop and just ask for a kapsalon. It's absolutely great. Definitely try it. And the last thing to cover is the picture here on the right, which are traditional clothing. So you have klomps, if you know them, these wooden shoes. There's a stereotypical Dutch clothing, like the farmers' outfit, the hats. No one really wears them. It's just historically we wore them. That is basically it. Now let's talk about Dutch politics. Like I said, I'll try not to go into too much depth. I really think you should just watch the other videos if you want to learn about Dutch politics. So there are two characters I want to highlight. One is the multi-party system that we have, which also means we have a polder model. This means that parties should come together to form coalitions. We have a lot of parties. None of them are going to be big enough to rule by themselves. And it is very, very few times that two parties are able to form a coalition together. Most coalitions consist of three parties and more. This means that party needs to come to an agreement to what policies is going to happen, which means you need to work together. You need to be willing to give and take some policies. And it also means you need to take responsibility. Because if you're going to drag out the coalition talks or are going to make it impossible for coalition talks to happen, you're basically jeopardizing politics, but again, also being able to make reforms. And this is important because the polder model was created from the fact that, yes, we need to work together to decide to make windmills to basically have all the water go out of my area. We also need to make dams because we are fighting the water all the time. So we need to be urgent. So yes, you need to discuss this and everyone needs to be involved, but also we need to come to concession quickly, and otherwise we won't be able to get the policy through that needs to happen. Another important aspect is we don't really have big left-leaning parties. We've been able to form left-leaning like coalitions. All coalitions that we had for a very long time have been right-leaning coalitions or center-right, or potentially a right-leaning party with a left-leaning party, and then you kind of like get a centrist. But the last actually fully left-leaning coalition that we had was, I think, roughly in the 60s, which is Cabinet Den Uyl, which was the prime minister, which was the Labour Party. So the Netherlands might be known for being left-leaning in the sense that we have a strong welfare state and we have all these things. But if you look at the government, we are actually quite right-leaning, and we keep voting for the right instead of voting for the left, which is also an important fact to know. Now, what are the big problems that we have? We have migration. This is one of those things where we have this become a really big issue in the Netherlands and a topic that oftentimes politicians talk about. But the issue is that we have human rights and that we have strong constitutions and like rights for migrants, which means that courts upheld them and hold the government accountable when it doesn't. but also we just are part of the EU, which means that you cannot have borders and you cannot have border control because that's against EU regulation and the like free travel that we have. So you make migration a really big issue, but then you can't do the tough policies that you vote for, which is, oh, we're going to limit the amount of immigrants that we're going to have to this amount per year. We're going to have strong borders. We're going to kick everyone out, all the kind of stuff. But you can't solve them because of all the policy issues. This is one of those things where, uh, we haven't really been able to solve this. There's just working that we need to do with the EU to solve this crisis. The other crisis that we have is the nitrogen crisis. Uh, and I'll just do the bare bone version here. The nitrogen crisis was basically that the Netherlands had standards for how much nitrogen we can put out and put into the air. This is because we have nature reserves that we want to protect, but also because of climate agreements and the fact that nitrogen just attacks the ozone layer and leads to more greenhouse gases, meaning that you just get more greenhouse effect happening because the light rays now get trapped between the gases as well as the Earth, which means that you get this continuous reflection back and forth, and that leads to heating of the Earth. As a consequence of this, we set our own standards. The government has been too liberal by allowing many projects with the idea that later on we will fix the problem. They just postpone the issue. Therefore, we are at our limits, and the courts have decided we cannot create any new building projects, all the kind of stuff, and we cannot give any new like papers and allow it for it because of the fact that we have this crisis and we haven't resolved this. This is a very big crisis. We've been trying to resolve it. There's new policy that's currently being discussed on how to solve this. And this has been a really big issue that we can't build new houses, we can't build new prisons, all that kind of stuff. So this is important. Again, there's a video that I did for Rotterdam Pre-EDC where I talk about the Nigerian crisis in more depth, where I explain where it comes from, how specific parties were responding to it, and what the actual current context is and how this affects farmers and all that kind of stuff. I really think you should just watch that one if you want to get more of an understanding of this policy and how this affected Dutch politics, but also Dutch society as a whole, the economy, the things that we were able to do and not able to do. The other thing that we have is a housing crisis. The housing crisis is really complex. So there isn't one issue that you can point to, which is this is the main issue. Because there are many characteristics that are working together. We have a lot of research going on, and it just shows that it's multifaceted. There are a couple of things. One, there might be a housing shortage that we have, so we don't have enough houses. Two, elderly people oftentimes want to live in their familiar homes and want to live in the homes that they, have, even though they might not use the second level, or the fact that they might be not even using the full house. Also because they might want to just keep that house and then give it to the next generation, all that kind of stuff, which means that you have people who might move to elderly center facilities and open up these new houses for the market, which leads to a new stream of people that like could get houses and like bigger areas. But this is just not happening. We have the fact that we can build new houses because of the nitrogen crisis. We have we are one of the countries which have a lot of regulations on housing. So we have maximum prices for things. We have requirements for what you need to do, which means that we also are one of the countries with the lowest rent yields, which also means that renting isn't attractive, but buying is. Then the idea would be if a lot of people who are currently renting are now buying, this would mean that people's houses that currently would be rented out would actually be bought, would actually be entered for new people to actually rent to, and there's other people to go to buy. But this clearly isn't happening right now because rent prices are still very, very high and still quite expensive. And it just shows that. And then the question is, people who are buying up the houses, are they speculating on them, e.g., keeping them unoccupied just so they can make more money, or are they keeping them unoccupied because there are low rent yields? Do you have a lack of like investment or a lack of allowing of maybe mega apartment structures in specific cities because there are skyline regulations or there are zoning regulations or there are slow processes of allowing people to start in their own building projects, all of that kind of stuff. These are all facets that are working together in a sector that's very, very complicated. So I'm not going to pretend to say these are the main issues, but it is rather many issues, and all of these are contributing in different ways in why the prices are high. And I think maybe to show this is that normally what you would recommend is maybe spending 30, maybe max 40% of your paycheck on rent. Because the idea is that you can save up, you have standards. If like you get fired, you also have more savings you can have to cover for the rent for a couple of months. But in the Netherlands, because it's so expensive, some people are just spending like 50 to 60 percent of their paycheck on rent, which is quite high and maybe not something that you would want to do. And this as well, we in the Netherlands do already have quite tight regulations on how much money you can ask per square meter and what a square meter can have. So it can't be like the distance to the roof needs to be a specific amount of meters. So it can't be all the meters in like, an angled roof house, all of that kind of stuff. So there are tight regulations that exist, but still it is expensive. And I think it's one of those things where it's just also high demand, low supply. A lot of people want a house, so you still go to that maximum. And the government also, even though you do have low yields, do still want to make it somewhat profitable. And because you still keep having these push factors that mean that people are, willing to pay a lot of money for houses, they still are getting to the limit quite high, which means that because they want the profitability of the people who are renting it out, that this is still happening. Okay, that's just basically the housing crisis. I would definitely recommend here doing also your own research, finding your own things about the Netherlands and the Dutch housing, because this is a very interesting aspect, and I think there could be a motion about Dutch housing and changing policy about housing in the Netherlands. But I also do know that there's a workshop for Dutch Euros that happened that was about housing. Okay, then the last issue that I want to talk about is prison shortages. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this is mainly to talk a bit about the justice system as a general, because the Netherlands used to focus a lot on rehabilitation. And this means that you do not punish as hard or as long because you want people to still be able to come back. And it also means that in prisons, you focus on rehabilitation programs, meaning people can get education, do have information about the outside world, and they have some contact there so that when they are let out, they're able to go back again. Why do we then actually have a prison shortage? It is because since the VVD has been in power, they've become a law and order party, which means that they want to go for harder punishments. And this looks for a couple of things. This means increasing fines and increasing kind of like max years that you can get for specific crimes. This looks like the DOJ, Department of Justice, or whatever translation it is, asking for like higher prices, for the higher punishments for specific crimes. And also, this looks like changing rules that we have for getting out early. So there used to be, I think, a specific percentage of the time that you would get that you need to serve, and a certain percentage, if you just were on good behavior, that would always fall away. That was kind of like that automatic idea of like if you're in good behavior, you get time away was removed, which means that also not just the punishment, but also the effective punishment gets higher. And these are things that are working together for getting people to get longer sentences, which means people are, first of all, getting more years, but also getting years in the first place longer, whereas alternatively, they might get other punishments. The other thing that you have with prison shortages is that we used to have too many prisons. So at some point, we shut a couple of them down. Some of them became hostile. Some of them basically got out of function. And these are things that just happened in the past that we now can make up. So it's not even that there's like a massive increase as well. It's also that we have decreased our capacity over the years because we haven't been using the prisons for a long time. Then these changes happened, and now we are, up the capacity that we have. This means that there are different questions that you can have about how do you solve this issue? Are you going to rent prisons from different places? Are you going to give more community services? Why might be a good thing, given again the change that we had for harsh punishments, but also to also characterize at the same time within this question what the justice system in the Netherlands looks like. Again, maybe to give like intuition on how forgiving we are. If you compare to, for example, the US system, you would expect a lot of times things like lifelong or 20 years or like a lot of time for things. But it can be, for example, that for murder you get 8 years in the Netherlands, or you are a pedophile and we know that you have made material for it and that you've texted minors and done explicit things with them. And then the judge might decide, well, that's all true, but we're not going to give you that much time. They only give you like maybe 4 years, and then you need to have forced therapy. And the 4 years was basically because of one, the family. The mom said, even though he did all those bad things, I still would want him out and want him part of my life. Even not like as a direct father of my child, obviously, but also because he was the breadwinner and he needs to basically support the family financially. That was taken into account. The other thing is we have things like forced therapy. And the idea here is that there are some things that are, like, for example, psychopathic personality trait, things that you can't really control, but you can change and and get better from. Same with pedophilia. There's at least maybe ways to maybe cure it, or at least ways that you can solve the specific issues that you have, the thinking, the thought process, all that kind of stuff. In that context, you can then um, in that context, you want to make sure that people don't go to prison for a very long time because in prison, they have to hide all their issues. They can't talk about their emotions. They need to seem tough, all that kind of stuff, which means that then when they go into that therapy process in the first place, then that takes way longer and it's way harder for them to actually get resolved. So those are other things as well. So that's why you have sometimes lower punishment, but then you have forced therapy. And that forced therapy basically lasts until you are cured. So this means that oftentimes you are not allowed to leave the compound. You are not allowed to get visitation from other friends when it is forced, all that kind of stuff. There's also like a lighter version that you have, which then gives you slowly more rights, which means that you can, maybe have a placement that's outside of the clinic, but then you do need to check in all the time. There's more allowance for you to maybe integrate. There may be less strict rules that you need to apply by, all of that kind of stuff. And these are things that the Netherlands finds important. That's why this thing like getting psychological help is in Dutch called like TBS is something that's important, but also something that is quite interesting, quite expert dependent. So the judges will always refer, or very, very often refer to what the expert says. So if the expert says this person clearly was in a manic episode and was so out of control, everything that they did was just not in their control, they should get treatment. Then oftentimes, like you can discuss with the lawyers and all that kind of stuff, and they can do all the talks they want to do. 99 out of 100 cases, the policy will just be followed that this psychologist says. Same thing for like they are schizophrenic and all that kind of stuff. Um, so this is also, I think, something interesting about the Netherlands is the focus on rehabilitation, but also specifically the mental health aspect of it, and that there's a lot of attention and focus for it, and the role that experts have in this in the justice system. Again, if you want more depth, I would really recommend going to those videos that I already have on Dutch politics. What I'll do now is I'll talk to you about what party politics, which parties I would recommend you at least listen to if you want to talk about Dutch politics or want to know actually what Dutch politics is. The main three parties you need to know, and this is if you don't have enough time to watch a lot of the videos, is VVD, because they're the center-right party, like the Conservatives in the UK. And these are basically the party that's been in the most coalitions in the last couple of years. So I would definitely recommend getting them. You'll know and understand a lot about the policies that happened. They're very important. They will be important for next future elections. The other party is the PVV. This is the more extreme right-wing party. This is the Geert Wilders party, something like the AfD or Reform UK. That is just very anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, all that kind of stuff. And then the last one is GroenLinks PvdA, which is merged together now, which is called Progressief Nederland or Progressive Netherlands. And this is the largest left-leaning party, currently the largest coalition party. Sorry, the largest opposition party. They are not in the coalition. Um, they're good to know for like Dutch politics, and to understand the left side of Dutch politics. Okay, now what are the other parties that you should know if you want to know actually a bit more depth? You actually want to be able to discuss Dutch politics with nuance and more in-depth analysis. That is D66, which is currently the party that has been given the prime minister. They've been part of a lot of coalitions. They are center-left, progressive. They're good to know to understand the role of these center parties, but also to understand specifically the current government, as well as the CDA. They are one of the largest. They're one of the largest right-wing parties. They're more conservative in a more religious way, but they are also more centrist in a lot of ways, so maybe a bit more willing for immigration and that kind of stuff. They are part of this coalition as well, which is between D66, CDA, and VVD. But also they have been part of a lot of other coalitions because they've been very important in Dutch politics historically. So if you understand these five parties, you definitely will be able to understand a lot of Dutch politics, and you should be able to debate basically anything when it comes to policies and the current coalition and politics in the Netherlands. If you want to have even more depth, then there's also videos about the other right-wing parts and other left-wing parties to understand where fracturing happens and how things uh, happen within the Netherlands and what their role is within politics. Now, moving away. So we have the monarchy. The monarchy in the Netherlands isn't very interesting in the sense that it exists, it does the general stuff a royal family does, but it isn't liked or controversial enough for it to be interesting, like motion wise. There still might be a case about the monarchy, like this house would banish the Dutch monarchy, but I think it is just a less extreme version of doing it for the British monarchy. So why am I saying this? There are people who like the Dutch monarchy, and there are generic reasons for this. They like the imagery, the culture, the perspective of this, the unified under one specific person. They might like the specific king or royal family, or like a specific person in the royal family that they relate to, or they has characteristics that they think are admirable. There are trade benefits because the king is able to play as an ambassador where other people might not because of political affiliation, because of the fact that other nations maybe do really value the concept of a king and a monarch, which means that you have more trade benefits and a lot of aspects as well. They give a lot of attention to charities. They do a lot of good work there and that kind of stuff. The negatives, of course, are they cost a lot of money. You're spending a lot of money for people just to be rich, and that is tax money that we could pay to poor people instead. I think the other thing specifically is that the king, so Willem Alexander, this guy, was not always liked a lot, especially when he was young. When he was young, he was kind of cocky, kind of like really thought a lot about himself, all of that kind of stuff. And people did not like it. So the only times we ever discussed lowering the amount of money we give to the monarchy, like in when we have the current, democracy, that kind of stuff, is when he was young, because we basically thought he was that much of a dickhead. Since then, he kind of cleaned up his act. He's become more normal. It's become less like a twat, and therefore people like him more. People also really like Maxima. Fun fact, Maxima is not Dutch. She's Argentinian. She speaks Dutch, she learned Dutch, and that's also why she sometimes does help for people who try to assimilate within the Netherlands, because she knows how hard it is to do the language and how hard it is to sometimes immigrate. Uh, and this is also another thing. Why do other reasons why people do not like the monarchy? It's kind of like elitist, can be outdated. There are other, again, generic reasons for the monarchy being good or bad. The monarchy in the Netherlands isn't necessarily very interesting. Amalia, the eldest daughter, is going to be queen when these two die. She's currently in the army. Um, that's dead. There's interesting characterization there. I think maybe good to know, maybe good to understand. And if there is emotion related to it, you can debate it. But there isn't much more to tell you than what I just told you. Now, geography. I already have a video which goes into more depth about the different regions and politics, so I will not rehash that information. I'll just talk a bit more about interesting Dutch stuff, some cultural stuff, some regional stuff, and just some very basic things that you ought to know. So let's start with the Randstad. The Randstad is a collection of cities in the Netherlands that are so big that form the biggest powerhouse in the Netherlands. So this is roughly the Randstad. Most economic activity happens here. So these are big cities like Amsterdam, Utrecht, The Hague, which is also where we have the International Court of Justice. We have Rotterdam, one of the largest ports in Europe or the world. Amsterdam, again, the main capital, a lot of service sector, all that kind of stuff. And this is a place that is progressive, has a lot of like people who are very progressive. There's also a lot of people who are like new money or like old money. So like rich people who make a lot of money of like, the Dutch form of Wall Street, if that makes sense. Those also exist here. They're often characterized by people outside of the Randstad as maybe a bit more arrogant, elitist, maybe also less intelligent people outside of it. Whereas the people outside of it might be characterized as maybe a bit more stupid or maybe a bit less economically developed, more rural, all that kind of stuff compared to the main places, the Randstad. Of course, this is the Netherlands, so we don't have as many regional places, which are very like agricultural, very agricultural, very poor, and that kind of stuff. Most places in the Netherlands still have cities nearby them, and it's because we are with 18 million people, so we're quite compact. So we have a lot of people living in a very small piece of land, and that means that everything has been effectively organized. So we have a lot of agricultural ground. So there's very few places that we just have actual nature just existing freely. We have a lot of cities, we have a lot of villages. Everything has like roads going through it being very well connected and a lot of like ways this is organized specifically. So this means that we don't have rural outbacks as you might have in larger countries because we are just too small and we have too many people. And we also do have economic activity in cities that happen here. So for example, I think there are also ports that exist here. We also have some manufacturing that happens here in these places. Arnhem here is actually very important for the energy transition, which just happened accidentally because there was a energy campus, which was companies that were dealing with things like uh, energy cables, like transition cables, all the kind of stuff that were happening in Arnhem. That hub stayed there, and this just developed with new companies popping up. So like energy consultancies, all of that kind of stuff. We have a technical university, I think, around here, which is Twente. We have another technical university here in Eindhoven, and these are technical universities, so they're applied universities. So they do applied physics, applied chemistry. So other companies who are engineering stuff and developing stuff are also around these places. So there's this joke that if you go study in Eindhoven, you'll never have to leave the city because you'll study there and then you immediately find a job. If you know what ASML is, we'll talk about it later. That's also near Eindhoven. Um, Other places like Maastricht also um, have like their own university. Nijmegen has their own university. So it's definitely the case that if you have a motion, which is should we put in more money into the Randstad or to other places, there's definitely economic development that can happen in these other places that isn't building up new cities or building up completely new sectors, but oftentimes expanding or moving centers. E.g., consultancy can also go and move a bit more towards Arnhem when there already is more energy consultancy there. Financial systems or sectors can also move away from Amsterdam, which means that they might have less networking effects. So they have maybe less other companies being there, but they might have the benefit of, for example, having cheaper land prices and still having highly educated workforce. In, for example, Nijmegen, because there's still a university there and still big and it's an expanding city. So definitely there is a lot going on in Netherlands, and it's quite nuanced. The thing to kind of understand, though, of course, that when it comes to agriculture sector in Netherlands, it is mainly everything outside of the Randstad. It's just a lot of agriculture, especially up north. And this means that this is quite yeah, built very, very close and very, very tight to each other. Just like these cities are very, very big. So it's very hard sometimes to see where Amsterdam actually ends and Utrecht begins. But it is still, this doesn't also affect, of course, how people see these places and the kind of communities that are created there. That is a rough idea of the geography. There are different ways that this interacts with religion. We're going to talk about that later. There's a different way in which this interacts with politics. I also talked already about that in a video on the geography of politics and notes. I'm not going to talk about that. There are some other maybe fun facts that I want to talk about. The first fun fact is the Netherlands has been, of course, fighting water for a very long time. In, I think, the 60s, we had really, really bad drowning that happened because this area all got flooded. So we built what's called the Delta Works, which are these huge dams that we built here to control the water flow and basically make sure that all of that drowning won't ever happen again. Um, we also have a very big dam that we built here. That means that this actually is a lake rather than part of like the sea, as well as here we build another kind of like dam. So we are quite good at actually defending ourselves in the water, and we have quite innovative systems that we are using and that we are always trying to research. So when you have a motion about climate resilience in the Netherlands, this is a clear example of the kind of technologies that we are using to fight against rising water issues that we have. Other important things are, of course, to know that the main thing that's interesting about climate change is the fight with water we have also changes because we now have more heat waves and we have hotter summers, which means that now in the summer we also get water shortages, which means that we are way more vulnerable to things like, wildfires. We are way more vulnerable to things like, you know, plants dying and crops dying and all that kind of stuff, which means that when it comes to actually changing our climate change plans, we need to adapt to the new system. And that's something that we still are somewhat struggling with because this is a completely new issue that we have. Um, Another consequence of us fighting the water is that a lot of things that happen is poldering, which I already talked about this. Removing the water that might, for example, happen here, like this used to be, I think there's a big lake already here. We basically dump all the water out here with the windmills, and then we create our own land. So a lot of the land in the Netherlands is underwater, like under the sea level, but also is very, very flat, which is why the Netherlands is known as just a very flat land and something that we it's just a consequence of our geography. Another thing that's I think is just fun is we create our own province. So Flevoland actually is not a natural province or land that actually existed. This is just something that we created because we wanted more land for productivity and economic activity and that kind of stuff. So we just create this province. It's completely flat. There's a lot of agriculture in here. The cities here are actually really, really ugly. That's just a fun fact as well. And that just also again shows you in a different way the kind of like ingenuity and experience that we have with dealing with water and technology and this kind of stuff. Yeah, I think everything that is the main things that I wanted to cover. A lot of the other things, like I said, can be found in other workshops or will be discussed later on, just like the cultural stuff. So let's now just go towards the next page, which will be about religion. So there are three major religions in the Netherlands. So the first one is Protestantism, which is 30%, Catholicism, which is 70%, and then it is Islam, which is 6%. We used to also have quite a big Jewish population, and that was known as quite tolerant towards the Jews because we allowed them to do whatever they have their own synagogue, not be prosecuted, if as long as they just paid us money. We wanted money, and that's why we had big populations in Amsterdam. That of course decreased after World War II, which never really got back to its full powers afterwards, because we also, of course, created the state of Israel, which meant a lot of people fled to there. Um, but if you have the question about why does that Judaism isn't maybe as big and Islam is bigger, that is the context for that. Now, the Protestantism and Catholicism is based regionally a lot. So if you look at this region here, so the south of the Netherlands, and then Gelderland, and I think also a bit like this is all Catholic, and this is the south. This has been Catholic for a long time. We had a Protestant Reformation, and when we had the Protestant Reformation, we were under Spanish rule, so we were part of the Spanish kingdom. The Spanish kings were very, very Catholic, so they really did not like us becoming Protestant. So what they did is they prosecuted us. So it meant that they were burning down our churches, they were punishing people, they were killing them and martyring us. As a consequence, the Protestants reacted with basically retaliation. So they burned down their own churches, they killed their own people, and this just led to the Independence War. And what happened is that a lot of the people that are living here are Protestant and they are Calvinist. So this is where you get maybe the cultural stereotype of the Netherlands being direct, maybe being a bit sober. In these regions, this happens, especially in the north. You have more of these places where you also don't want to seem like you're better than everyone else. You want to not spend as much money on like your clothes or like get a lot of like fancy stuff because you don't want to show off because that's just not the Calvinist way. You need to work hard. You need to be good to God, and you need to show that you're basically going to do your place and do the thing that you need to do because God already knows where you're going to be in heaven or hell. It's just going through the process. Whereas in the South, it's more focused on things like the Burgundic lifestyle. So it's more about celebrating life. It's more about drinking beer. It's more about having fun and laughing through the pain and that kind of stuff. So that is more of the kind of Catholicism they have. And there's also the cultural differences that you have between the South and the North, where the North may be more sober and more direct. The South is a bit more party-like. They have celebrations like Carnival, where they dress up during February and give a candy to kids, and dress up weirdly and drink a lot of alcohol. And you don't do that in the North. That is the divide. And this divide has also just been very pragmatic, held up also after we got independence. So, what do I mean with that? The because a lot of the very big cities, such as Amsterdam and Rotterdam, during the uh, independence war were Protestant, and they were mainly like financing the independence war, they were also the people who had the seats of power when we became independent, and they weren't going to prosecute the Catholics, partially because they would just start a whole new war. Um, and part of it is kind of like just a feat with the war that you would have. Um, so what happened as a consequence is they did a lot of policies where they tried to keep people in the south. And the reason why they still wanted to have these regions, of course, is because even though it was Catholic, it's just nice to have larger land. You have more money, you have more economy, you're more prestigious, all of that kind of stuff. And it's still more like Dutch in that way. Of course, the idea of a Dutch identity maybe didn't exist in the time because, again, this is somewhat during the Middle Ages, but it is something that they cared about. But it's also meant that some of the stereotypes that existed between the North and the South still exist as a consequence of this. So the South has accents, and these are oftentimes identified as having more stupid accents and people who just sound kind of like weird and kind of like funny and that kind of stuff. People in the North also have their own accents, but they are seen as more sober and more direct, and their accent necessarily isn't seen as someone who is stupid. The reason for that is as a consequence of this divide still happening and Protestants not necessarily liking the Catholics, the Protestant North and the big cities didn't invest much in education in the South. They were focusing and prioritizing a lot the places that were actually more um, Protestant. So a lot of like places got universities quite late. And that is why you have the stereotype of them not being educated because you didn't invest in the schools in there and that kind of stuff. So this is actually a remnant of that independence war and a remnant of that, and it's basically become a trend because there's still the stereotype from this the people who talk like this kind of like sound stupid and kind of like sound weird. The same way the people from the South you wouldn't maybe like in the US you wouldn't necessarily think sound like smart or intelligent. Um, because they sound more like hillbillies, so you have more of an idea of like farmers with them being smart. So this is again a context both religious wise, also religion wise, and also culture wise of what the different cultures are within the Netherlands and the regions and how they view each other. Now, what else do we have? We have the fact that most of the Netherlands is atheist, and this is like roughly 58%. Let me just remove all the things from the map. And this is just a general trend that we see within Western societies. Again, you can think of structural reasons for this, the fact that we believe more in science, so we don't need God creating heavens and like the planets the way that we do from the Bible, but rather we believe in the Big Bang or believe in evolution theory over Adam and Eve. Um, that kind of stuff. We already have a good life, we have welfare system, we have community, family, friends, and we have good enough jobs, which means that overall we don't need to find community and need to find meaning in things like religion, which means that overall we are just getting away from this. Interestingly, the group that this isn't as much for is for Islam. And the reason is that the reason why we have 6% of the population being Islamic has to do with immigration. So we have a lot of people coming from Turkey and Morocco who are doing jobs that we as the Netherlands do not want to do. Things like cleaning or like hard labor, the kind of stuff. Jobs that we feel like are not paid enough, or places or jobs that are maybe beneath us because we have too high education, that kind of stuff. These people are oftentimes coming from Islamic background and they keep that. And integration in the Netherlands has been a bit interesting because we do require you to now integrate, but historically that hasn't always been the case. So we had like what's called labor migrants, and this means that within the first generation, a lot of people came. They would also, in the end, bring over their family. But we didn't tell them that you have to actually assimilate to Dutch. So you don't need to learn the Dutch language, which meant that we actually had large swaths of populations and parts of cities that were maybe Turkish or Moroccan dominated, where people in those places did not actually speak Dutch or did not assimilate to the Dutch culture. This also means that the next generation then, of course, becomes a bit like in this bubble, like they grow up in this bubble, which also means they identify more strongly with Islam and their culture and that kind of stuff. Even if they're also first generations which did assimilate, you also see that second generation and third generations oftentimes become more strongly tied to their like identity of the nationality that they came from or the religion. And I think this has to do with aspects of they are different, right? So you are a second generation Muslim. You look different than the people around you. You have maybe different customs. And to maybe give something that's more tied to your experience and to deal with the discrimination that you fear, that you feel, or like the differences you have from your peers, or the struggles that you see your parents going through being immigrants or being Muslims, all that kind of stuff means that you more tightly identify with that community and you want to protect that because the out group seems as more attacking and is more attacking to you, and you want to defend that in group. So this also means that the second and third wave of like immigrants also become more pro like Islam and also more religious, which means that this trend doesn't necessarily work as much for this group, and also does lead to an interesting question what this actually will do within society. So this explains to a certain extent why people have issues with immigrants and like assimilation and this kind of stuff, because it's not just about immigrants coming in, but also past policies that have happened and how this has changed demographics and what we ourselves as Netherlands have expected from these migrants, and then how they have responded, and how this has basically led to a back and forth where we are now. So that's the main thing about atheism that's been increasing. I want to also just give you a few of the Bible Belt. So Bible Belt is a religious place that looks like a belt of Netherlands. So it starts in the southwest and then it goes northeast. The main thing here is that a lot of the Bible Belt is just deeply religious and Protestant. And here's also where you still have your maybe generic form of discrimination, sort of things that you maybe associate with, like the Deep South in the US. So you have teachers saying to their children, actually, the Big Bang and evolution theory are not actually true. They're only theories. We know that the Bible is true. We're only going to teach you this because of the fact that this is going to be asked in your exam. Or these are places where if you are gay, your family will kick you out and they will not accept you and they will not love you and the community will not accept you. Or if you are a woman and you wear shorts or you wear a skirt that is too small or even pants, you get looked down upon and you get called a slut and that kind of stuff. So this is the deeply religious place. And this is showing that the image that you might have of the Netherlands as being a progressive place is true and it does exist, especially in big major cities for a variety of reasons. Big cities being oftentimes places where you have more immigrants and you oftentimes have more networking effects. You also have more universities there. So oftentimes this means that you also get in contact with these communities more. These are oftentimes also a bit more LGBT free spaces and like safe spaces for these people, which means that people who tend to go to these big cities just get more exposed to different cultures, but also tend to be a bit more highly educated, which correlates with them being more progressive. So like the kind of like perceptions that you have do exist and are true, but it is also true that it is more nuanced because there is a very conservative streak that we have in the Netherlands that is conservative in the way that you think it is conservative. Okay, I also talk about the Bible Belt, by the way, about the geography in the Netherlands, and I talk a bit more about the politics and a bit more about what happens there. If you want more depth, go to that specific video. Now we get to economics. So the Dutch economy is quite strong. So it's like, depending on how you measure it, it's kind of like the 18th worldwide, and I think it's the sixth in the EU. And there's one of the like smaller nations, like it's one of the like biggest economies compared to how small it is. So other nations are from the first are like Germany, France, Spain, that kind of stuff. So we are doing quite well, and we are being quite rich. The one thing that we kind of pride ourselves on is something called fiscal discipline. So we focus on making sure that the amount of money that the government spends isn't too much. So this means that you have a budget shortage that you have every year can only be at most 3% of your GDP. That's your like your domestic product, which means that these are all the things that you're going to produce uh, within a year. And the idea is also that the debt basically is lower, like your total debt, than 60% of your GDP. And the idea is that we hold tight to this, and that is why some cabinets and coalitions focus on, for example, having like a negative, like having a 0% budget deficit. So having no budget deficit at all, and priding themselves on that. And there have been times where this hasn't happened. So you can think of crises, so like the dot-com crisis in the early 2000s. You can think of like the credit crisis that happened within the EU after the 2008 collapse of the housing bubble. You can think of COVID. So there are times when we've been kind of like over it, but this is something that we focus on. And this is also how the Netherlands perceive itself in the context of the EU. So we see ourselves of this is what the EU wants us to do. So the idea is we are one of the good nations, we're holding to the regulations, but there are fiscally more irresponsible nations like Greece and Italy, and they should basically hold more to these rules. And we are basically changing our policy and doing the right thing, but they are not doing it. So this is also how we see those other nations, or this is at least how this also gets talked about in the news, especially by right-wing parties. Sector-wise, we are a service sector based economy. So roughly 80% of our GDP actually is within the service industry. It gives us employment of like the total employment, it's like 84% of it. Um, and this actually, the percentage of space actually is wrong. Actually, the service industry is actually roughly 8 to 10%. So this is actually mixed up with agriculture. So it's actually not that much. This becomes more important when we get to agriculture when it comes to the amount of space. This graph like shows that we are a very big sector, very big service economy. This is because we are a very highly educated population, and we also do have access to things like ports, places. We have very good climate for companies. We'll talk a bit about it later. And there's a lot of sectors here. There's are things like finance sectors, consultancy sectors, all of these things that are big in the Netherlands, especially in the Randstad, where there's a lot of like networking effects happening of companies being able to network with each other, which is where they benefit from. Um, so this is the service industry that we have that's very, very big. The industry is also actually quite big. It's even bigger than agriculture. It gives ourselves 20% of GDP and it gives us roughly 40% of the employment. And it takes roughly 2 to 3% of this total space that we have. And we'll talk a bit more about what we actually produce, but it is oftentimes, again, what you think of maybe more high tech. So these are things that require high education, high technology, not things that require like cheap labor. And these are the things that we focus on in the industry. Agriculture is interesting because you might hear the Netherlands is the biggest agriculture exporter after the US and maybe China. However, the agriculture sector is 2% of our GDP, 2% of our employment, and takes roughly 54% of our space. Um, and the reason for this is we are a large exporter, but that's because we re-export a lot. So we buy cheap grain from Ukraine and then we export it from the port of Rotterdam to then go to the UK, for example. So this is the way that we become one of the large exporters because we re-export stuff, not because we actually make and produce our own stuff. We are, when it comes to agriculture, specifically specialized in things like um, farm animals. So this is like livestock. So this is cows, pigs, all that kind of stuff. We are one of the largest like producers of these animals. And we also are a large producer of like the meat that comes from that and all the kind of stuff. We are the largest within the EU. And I think this is also one of those things where this is one of the reasons why we have a lot of nitrogen and a lot of like gases that come because a lot of these animals just let out a lot of gases and a lot of heat is needed for them to be kept in nice places and that kind of stuff. And I think this is also interesting because agriculture takes up a lot of our space, but also is one of the ways that we need to make for the nitrogen crisis. Like our agriculture sector needs to shrink. It cannot expand. We cannot have more gases go in because we're already over our limits. Um, and the effect on it is relatively small on our economy because we are not that big in the form of employment or our GDP is dependent on it, but it is very big in the form of also perception. So like people from the rural areas do align with these farmer groups. So that is why you have so much backlash against this. It also is a lot of places where we could potentially build or we could potentially create more nature areas or do things like again plant trees so we capture more of the gas and that kind of stuff. But we don't because it's still a large part that we have. There's the 54% of agriculture also means that these are people, important stakeholders. Oftentimes land's also expensive because again we're quite a small country with a lot of people, so a lot of land is very desired, which means that overall this just means that the agriculture sector in the Netherlands is quite nuanced in its placement within the economy and also within politics. Now let's get to now to more exports. So this is just our actually the overview of our exports, and as you can see, we have a lot of tech, we have computers, broadcasting equipment, all the kind of stuff that we produce a lot. This is kind of like comparative. So the amount of size that it is showing you how much it is of the export. We have medication. This is also looks like vaccines. We have refined petroleum. We have photo lab equipment, medical instruments. So this is high tech that we have. Other things are, as you can see here, also animal food. Things like beers. This is more like agricultural products or food products that we create, and also things like cars, some scrap irons. There's actually some lower forms of like refined stuff that you would have, and that kind of stuff. So this shows you that maybe not what you'd expect, but that we are like a lot of export of very more high-tech stuff. Again, the intuition is that we are also a very easy place to export from. We have good infrastructure. We're quite stable as a government. We have a stable economy. We have clear expectations and rules and regulations, but also we have a lot of like highly skilled individuals, which explains why a lot of the experts that we have are actually in these sectors. Okay, I don't want to drill on this too much. If you want to go into more depth, you can do a bit more research by yourself. There's a Central Bureau of Statistics, which has all of these pictures and more details on the Dutch economy that you could go to if you want to have even more refined understanding of exports and things we have. Now, why? Let's then also talk about businesses. So there are some big businesses that we have. Shell, it's actually not Dutch anymore, but it's a big petroleum one. ING, which is a bank. Philips used to be really big. It's like medical equipment focused mainly on now, but it used to also create like DVD players, TVs, a lot of like technical aspects. The company is still big, but it's kind of like dying out because of a lot of decisions it made over its time, and now it's mainly focused on medical equipment. Heineken, of course, beer. Rabobank, which is another bank. ASML, you might hear as well. This is a company which has the monopoly on machines that make the chips. So you have a lot of machines. They basically use lasers and a lot of other cool physics stuff. They are very precision based. They're very highly skilled and highly technical. And ASML is the only one who's able to produce these these machines. A lot of interesting motions that you can have here. ASML really needs a lot of labor from outside, so highly skilled labor. So a lot of people, for example, from India, from the US, who are really, really smart, work for ASML. So you have when you have regulations that are tight on immigration, ASML will be hurt. There's also a question of whether ASML should actually sell the machines to China. Again, the reason being is you don't want to help China with maybe the AI stuff, or you don't want to have China be really able to outcompete a lot of the companies that you maybe want to make within the EU or within the Netherlands. But then the problem is that you not only does ASML lose out money, but the potential alternative is that China says, okay, well, if you don't going to give the machines, fuck it, we're going to create our own company with our own smart people, and then ASML might be outcompeted in the long term. Those are also important aspects when it comes to ASML. There's also a question of whether you want to break up ASML or not. I don't think it's actually a good motion because kind of you need the market capture for ASML to be this big and to be this important actor. If you get the issue of competition, you get the issue of China being potentially able to access these sources more, and you don't really get that much benefit from the competition because these are already so much high tech, and there's already so much non-disclosure agreements and patents placed within ASML that it becomes incredibly messy to break up ASML in the first place. Other big companies, Spar, this is a grocery shop chain. Randstad is a HR firm like consultancy, but also sending people towards other companies. KPN is like for like internet and telephone and TV and that kind of stuff. And Unilever is food, so a lot of brands actually fall under this. So there's a lot of big companies, and it shows you that oftentimes these are someone in the service industry. They are in the tech industry, and they oftentimes require people who are very highly educated. We in the Netherlands do have a very highly educated population, but we also do have somewhat of a shortage on it, and that's why we have the immigration in the first place. So the positives that we have of the business climate are the fact we have low taxes. So if you know about the Dutch-Irish sandwich, is the way that basically companies are able to save a lot of money on taxes by, moving assets towards the Netherlands and Ireland and then back to the Netherlands. I think that's how it kind of works. And this is why we have a lot of these companies here. We have a highly educated population. We're internationally oriented. Again, we have a port. We have a lot of like big institutions that work here of headquarters here. And we also have a quite trustworthy government institutions, lack of corruption. We have a good justice system that's consistent, and you can know it's predictable. The negatives of this, and this is also what the right always talks about, is we have a lot of rules and regulations. This might be for construction, this might be environmental stuff, this might be for like having everyone always check things. You have a lot of research you need to do beforehand. If the research finds out that there's potentially a protected animal species, they need to do mitigatory things, or you might not even be built, they're allowed to build. for like a year or at all. So like there's a lot of things that are holding construction back, construction of, for example, new factories, but also potential expansionism, but also just trying to start a company in the first place, and starting up within the Netherlands. Other things is, again, we're quite a small country. We have a lot of people, so there's oftentimes high land prices. Things are very expensive. The Randstad is very expensive. So for people that you want to pay there, you have to pay them a lot because the cost of living being expensive there, but also the buildings that you would hire or rent would also be expensive. There's some of those shirts on workers, like I said, highly educated. We do have them, but oftentimes, but large groups of them also come from outside of the Netherlands. And like I said, the general high cost. And I think this overall is the Netherlands and the Dutch economy. Of course, it's multifaceted, different aspects that I can focus off, but I focus on. But I do think this gives you the basic idea of what the benefits and what the negatives are of the Dutch economy, where it actually is dependent on how choices would affect, uh, companies or its sectors and that kind of stuff. Now let's go to the energy transition. So historically, the Netherlands has used a lot of coal. A lot of the coal that we had actually came from the south, so from Limburg. That basically closed down when we stopped going from coal, and we found a very large gas field in Groningen, which is in the north. This is, I think, roughly 0.3% of like the total world supply of gas was in Groningen. It became a really big part of our export. That's actually where the concept of Dutch disease is named after. It's because we found gas and it affected our currency. If you want to know what it is, Google it. There are a lot of quick explanations of what it is. So the gas in Groningen used to be a big part of our own energy production, but we decided in the end to close the fields. And when we say close the fields, is we put cement in all the holes that we had so we wouldn't be able to drill in it again. The reason why I made such a drastic change is because people in Groningen started experiencing earthquakes. And this led to a lot of backlash and a lot of people not wanting to have these gas fields in the first place. And therefore, people become quite angry at the government. In the end, the government yielded and said, okay, we're not going to get more gas from Groningen. We're actually going to close the fields. However, there is a question of whether or not, if you look at this from the perspective outside of just a neutral person, whether this is a good thing or not. Because now we get gas from other places, such as the US or maybe from the Middle East. These places also will get earthquakes from the fact that they are now extracting all of this gas. The reason why this was significant within the Netherlands is because we are a nation which is built on the idea of having control, right? If you're always fighting the water, you want to have control of your environment. So you want to have dams, you want to have ways that if there is a flooding that you're able to get over it and get rid of it, and have like creeks that are able to get the water away as quickly as you can. So we have that ingrained in our culture, and we're not used to earthquakes in the first place. So therefore, this became a significant thing where earthquakes basically became the deciding factor on whether or not we're going to extract gas or not. You can have your opinions about this, whether this is legitimate or not. But if you look at the net picture of this does this mean that overall in the world there will be less earthquakes or any side effects we get from fracking or getting gas in the first place? And then the answer is just no, because these other places will just get more of these earthquakes because they're exporting it more to us. But within the Netherlands, we don't have that, and it might be a shot that you're willing to take. Another thing that we are looking for right now is getting nuclear energy. We already have nuclear energy somewhere here, which is in Zeeland. And this is a nuclear energy plant that we had. We had another one, but we closed that down in the 90s. And now we're thinking of getting a new one. The drama that is happening is we want to actually, there's only really one place that it would make sense to build, and that's in Groningen. The reason for it is you need a way to transport the electrical energy to go from the place that it is being created to the place that needs it most, which in this case is the Randstad. Remember, that's this specific place where a lot of the big cities are. The energy grid that we currently have allows us to the cheapest placement to be in Groningen, because then that is way to us to transport actually to this place, because there already isn't existing infrastructure there. All other places are infeasible, either due to safety concerns or because of the fact that we have to create significantly new infrastructure, such as energy grids and that kind of stuff. That is not possible when you're not allowed to build because of the nitrogen crisis, but also it becomes really, really much more expensive. But the issue is that Groningen does not want to have a nuclear facility within Groningen in the first place. So there's a classic NIMBYism happening here. And there's just a problem of a lack of good alternatives. So this is a direct wave that we have in the Netherlands, whether or not we're going to go to nuclear energy. And again, there's also a generic question you can have here about, is this a good alternative? Should we just force this on Groningen, given that we did not, did close the gas for Groningen? So maybe, it's fair for them to actually have nuclear energy, but maybe again, we also did harm them with, extracting the resource there and creating earthquakes. And this would be again going against their wishes. So I think that's always an interesting question and an interesting debate. This might be a debate topic in of itself, but it's also good to kind of know where we get our energy from. There are other sources that we still get, so we still import oil and gas, of course, from other nations like the Middle East, but we are also trying to create an energy transition where we go to more towards more green energy. So this looks like building more windmills, and this time electric windmills, not the old classic windmills that we have that we use for getting water out of it, in, for example, the sea or in places in the Netherlands, or having more solar panel farms and having more solar panels in cities on roofs and that kind of stuff. This energy transition comes with a couple of issues. The first one is that green energy inherently is unreliable. So there's kind of always a so the question is if it's for example windy or very, very sunny, and you suddenly produce enough energy, you need to store it. So you need a lot of batteries to actually place it. And then you also need to have good regulators to actually release it. Because there's basically a stable supply that you need to have of energy, because there's a stable demand for this energy that oftentimes needs to be things like nuclear energy, stone coal, all that kind of stuff. And then the idea is that you then would use something like during the peak moments. So this oftentimes actually when people come home, like roughly at 4, or like also around like 12 when people come home from lunch, or like in the morning when they maybe put in the washing machine before they go to work. Like in those moments, you would want to actually have the release of, and have the flexibility of potentially like green energy or like any sources that are quicker in creating energy if you are maybe in like a very low period of having energy, or having, for example, wind and sun and that kind of stuff. So that is the issue of demand and supply being quite dynamic, even within days, but also now also the supply becoming dynamic because it's dependent on factors that are outside of our control, e.g., the weather. The other issue that comes with the energy transition is net congestion, where there is either too much demand of energy or too much supply of energy, um, because of, again, the same kind of factors, which means that you might have, again, energy shortages, or you might have circuits not working because there's too much energy and that kind of stuff. That is another issue that we're working with, and this also is something that might affect companies, might affect just attractiveness of the Netherlands, but also is an issue that we need to work towards. So the energy transition isn't just as easy as, oh, we just build more nuclear energy, or oh, we just need to build more green houses and that kind of stuff, because you need to change the energy grid to adapt to the more electrified system that you're going towards, and you also need to have good communications about the supply and demand of energy. So that is the energy sector in Netherlands, which is important to again understand what is happening here, but also why this is a big issue within the Netherlands. Now we're getting towards the end. I want to now focus on the strong welfare phase that we have. So the welfare state that we have is kind of like a mix of free market and having state interventionism. And I think the healthcare is the best example here. So everyone is forced to have health insurance that you need to pay for. So there's a basic package that you're forced to get. Um, then there are certain treatments that you can get that is basically deductible, or what in Dutch is called their own risk. This means that if you need to take specific kind of medical treatment, you need to pay for it. For example, blood test. If you need to take a blood test, you need to pay that for yourself, and it's up to a certain amount. So in a year, you can only spend 350 euros. That from the 350 euros, you need to pay yourself. After that, it should be covered by the insurance. However, some things are not part of your own risk or deductible. So you are always allowed to go to the physician for free. This means that this is something that you don't becomes part of your deductible. So some of this is kind of like nationalized. Something is like still paid for, but you paid for yourself. And then also we have regulations on how much things can cost. Then, of course, there are treatments that you might not be insured for. And if you're not insured for it, you need to pay it for by yourself. This might be, for example, things like dental, and that kind of stuff. But also you can change the kind of package that you want to get. So if you want to get an insurance package which includes dental, you need to pay more. But they also might do something the opposite, which is your deductible or your own risk becomes more than 350. So it might, for example, become 850 euros. So up to spending 850 euros per year only after you've spent that much money on specific uh, uh, like things, so like specific medical treatments. Only then does the insurance cover it. But then you do get a cheaper like price for the insurance. Then there are also other things such as insurance companies are not allowed to say no to you, especially when it comes to kind of like getting the basic package. Because otherwise, it would just mean that there are people who would not be able, like you're forced to get something, but you're not allowed to get it. And there's also, again, price caps. So they can't just make you pay like 2,000 euros per year because you are poor and therefore they think that you have a higher risk of actually getting this insurance. So there is competition between insurances, but also there is in some way state interventionism in the regulations that we have. But there's also the state providing some specific uh, uh, like medical treatments and that kind of stuff. So this shows you how complicated it can be and how the idea that we have is we want to be able to provide for everyone and we want to make sure that people are able to get the help that they need. But we also do not want to make it so that we are paying for everything and people who are able to pay more are going to pay more, or that we reward people or allow people to choose their own kind of thing. Um, so this is the kind of thing that we have focused on. Similar with Social Security, so we have, for example, social housing. This means that if you are poor enough or you don't have enough income, then the state has subsidized housing. This means that either the state has paid a rental company or has paid a like firm to make social housing in the first place. There's requirements. You need to have a specific income. This income is going to be checked every year to make sure that you're not suddenly making a lot more money and that you're able to live in this. And the idea is just there are places that are very expensive, and you don't want people to spend like 60% or 70% of their income on rent because those just financially ruin them. There are also questions of whether or not this distorts the market, whether or not this means that construction plans become hard to do because you require a certain amount, a percentage of being social housing, whether or not this means that you also lead to less competition and less demand in these kind of like sectors, all of that kind of stuff. But then again, you could also say this means that at least these people would cover it because the free market is unlikely to cover them and that kind of stuff. So it's a generic question that you have about social housing. Another thing is like benefits. So if you do not have a job or you cannot get a job, you basically get checked. Okay, is this something that's like medical or mental or anything else? And if it's not the case, then you have to apply for jobs and you need to show that you've applied for jobs. And then after that, then you get the benefits after a certain amount of time. But even while you are on benefits, just like the municipality still requires you to have meetings with them to discuss have you applied to new jobs because you need to continue to apply. And then you say, did you get an offer? And if not, if you didn't get an offer, why did you not accept it? That kind of stuff. They can revoke the funding if they think that the reasoning is not good enough. And they can also like actually allow you to like unreasonable. So again, the reasoning is you want people to still get a job that in the end will be longevity, right? So if someone is doing a job that they really don't want and they really don't like, this is not good for the company, but also means that in 3 months they'll get fired and then they'll be back at the government, and then you have to start the whole process over again. So there is a one hand leniency that they want to make sure that you get a proper job. So if you had, for example, a specific medical or like nursing education that you had, and it's just hard to find a job for that now, they will say, sure, we're going to make sure that you get a job in someone in medicine because we're not going to make you make it like a package bringer or like anything else, because there's not going to be something that's going to get you happy. Maybe if again this is going to be long enough, we might actually force you to do this because again, we do require you to get work. You are able to work, and there is an alternative job for you that you're able to get. But in the meantime, for at least maybe a year or half a year, you're able to get these benefits, not doing that job, and being able to maybe still live with that. And again, this shows you that social welfare in that is a bit more complex and complicated. It isn't always just you give free money or you have like oversight. It's also the state trying to help you find and accommodate this and also keeping control over the situation. Then education. This is specifically for university students. You get money from the state. Besides that, you are allowed to loan money from a state organization. Then this would have cheaper prices for like the interest rate that you would pay than like banks, and then you would pay this off when you work your interest like with the interest rate. So you don't pay back the money that you get from the state anyways, but you do pay back the loan that you could take on top of that. I think it's roughly like 500 or 700 years that you get per month, which would cover like your house, maybe if you're a bit lucky, and then also groceries if you're being tight enough. And then you still have to pay for your own tuition fee, you still have to pay for your own books and that kind of stuff. And you also have to pay, of course, for your own housing. The money also is again proportional. So if you are poor, you can ask for more money anyway. So if your family is poor, then you can ask for money and then you get more state subsidies, as more state help. And also, if you're actually living at home, you get less money because you don't need to pay for housing. So these are all again kind of like ways which shows you that again, it's a strong welfare state. So we have a lot of money that we give to this, but also it is a bit more complicated and a bit more complex than just giving free money. And there's also a lot of change that we happened. So in education, at some point we got rid of the model where we gave money and we just made everyone loan money. The idea was that the interest rates would be zero, so you would loan money for no interest rate. So you still get debt, but you still would only not need to pay interest over that debt. However, they changed that policy and he said, actually, how we said we made the promise of actually making you pay not interest, we're going to make you pay interest. And then also, you know what? Everyone really disliked this plan, so we're going to actually implement the old plan, which is actually getting money from the state, which is again the thing that I explained. So that used to be how it was before. Then they did the loaning system, and then now they also have the system where they give you money. And it shows you this is also changing. It's also becoming a bit more right wing in certain aspects, but it's also still maybe more left leaning that you would have in other countries, especially compared to the US and that kind of stuff. So this is explaining the strong welfare state that we have within the Netherlands. Then culture. A lot of things I've already talked about when it comes to religion and Calvinism and the divide between North and South and the Randstad and outside the Randstad. So this is what maybe a bit more softy stuff. So the kind of like yays and nays that we have here, the yays is we are quite direct, which is good because we have a understanding of where you are with us. So we can call things out. We're not afraid to talk to strangers. We're not afraid to like call strangers out, that kind of stuff. Of course, doesn't mean that everyone does this and that we always do this. It is a on the margin comparing different societies. We are more direct than others. There's also is a way that this happens within companies. So people are not afraid to speak out against their boss. We have relatively um, not as hierarchical like companies and that kind of stuff. That's very normal. Compare this to friends where you have very, very hierarchical companies and like speaking out against the boss or like making a suggestion against the boss is something you really wouldn't do. So this is something that is also working in the business culture. Another thing we have is we like bikes. If you are not used to seeing a lot of bikes, this is a normal biking parking space near a central station. So you have a lot of bikes everywhere on the bridge, a lot of parking spots, and it's just because we bike a lot everywhere we can because it's flat. We also have good infrastructure for it. We have a lot of like good biking infrastructure, and also we have a lot of like public transport that you could use, and also in the form of like parking places, but also buses and trains and that kind of stuff, which means you can park there and then use that and then not rely on a car. We're also big football culture. Football is one of the most important sports within the Netherlands. There are other sports that we like. So we have Max Verstappen in currently in Formula One, which means that we care about Formula One now. If Max Verstappen suddenly dies or stops with Formula One, I think the amount of people who would watch it would significantly decrease. There are other sports that we watch somewhat, so like something like tennis, basketball. We have a actually somewhat competent baseball team for some reason. Rugby isn't that big in the Netherlands. Ice hockey isn't big in the Netherlands, but field hockey is big in the Netherlands. So that's the thing that you play out on grass with sticks and that kind of stuff. Um, but the main sport still is really football. And the other thing that's big is, of course, the Winter Olympics, and these are things like ice skating. So we don't have that much skiing and snowboarding because, again, we're a flat country. We don't have many regions where we could naturally go for skiing and bodyboarding or like snowboarding, except for maybe, again, Austria, Germany, and Switzerland or Italy or like France to go there. But we don't have that within our country. But ice skating is big. We win a lot of medals with that. It's kind of like a national pride. Um, I would say like normally this would happen in the winter a lot, but due to climate change, the amount of times that we're able to actually go out and go ice skating on the waters, so our lakes or sometimes even historically we used to be able to actually skate on our rivers. That is just not happening as much anymore because of climate change and just us having less cold winters anymore. Um, Again, fun fact of how our culture and our sports is changing due to climate change. A lot of things is that we are relatively open people in the sense that, again, we're direct. You can ask quite a lot of direct questions. We also have, again, as Dutch houses, we have open windows, which means our curtains are open and you can look inside with the idea that we have nothing to hide. And this comes to a certain extent back from Calvinism and like not having to hide anything and this and that. So that's also when you walk in the streets, you can just actually look inside the house and can see what people are doing at night and you can see what they're watching and that kind of stuff. But also we're very scheduled, which means that if you want to meet up with people, it's not a, oh, let's just call someone and let's just meet up now and just do something impromptu. It's more of a, oh, let's set up a meeting next week on Tuesday. I have time. Let's meet up then. Um, which is also, I think, something that's less spontaneous as maybe other cultures like you have in Spain or France and that kind of stuff. Other things, of course, we're liberal. We're quite progressive. We are the first nation to actually allow gay marriage. This doesn't mean, and also I think overall it's quite progressive. So I'm able to wear a skirt, and there aren't many people watching me like very weirdly. Whereas in other nations that definitely happens more. So for example, the UK or even in France. Um, and this is especially in like big cities that we are quite progressive, but do again note that we do have the Bible Belt and we do also have more conservative regions that are in more rural areas. So it isn't just a full picture, but I do think this also shows in maybe Dutch politics. So again, we don't have any party talking about like, oh, there are trans people in our sports, or we don't have that many parties, like maybe only the SGP, who's like against gay marriage or like talks about that kind of stuff. Compared to again maybe the South in the US and the Republicans and kind of like the politics of disgust that they play towards the LGBT community. We don't have that in the Netherlands, which kind of also shows that at least to large parts it is ingrained both institutionally, politically, but also culturally in most people, or at least enough for it to be normal enough. And the rule plays to maybe be the exception to the rule. A lot of things as well is that you find out is we have a lot of regulations and we're very well organized. So this means that we have clean places, we have nice cities, we have nice roads. There's also a lot of like regulations for how good it must be looking, and a lot of research that needs to be done before construction. So, for like in the ground, what's the context there? What will be the ecological impact of this? Do we need to protect our animals here? All of that kind of stuff, which is both it's positive and negative, which immediately again gets me to the nays. So the nays are also direct. Again, we can maybe come across maybe as somewhat of dicks, which means that people might not really necessarily like this. Maybe we should be a bit more gallant, maybe a bit more tactical, and maybe be less direct when someone asks us about our opinions. This is a preference that individuals might have, and that kind of stuff. Another aspect is bikes. There's some people who do not like bikes. I jokingly asked people what the kind of like yays and nays are to have a culture. Some people said the yays were bikes, someone said the nays were bikes. Especially in Amsterdam, I would recommend watching out because people are very aggressive on the bikes. And if you are walking on the bike path, there is a chance of you to get hit if you're not paying attention. Another thing is about the football culture. Not everyone likes football, but also, of course, there's hooliganism. Um, there's also, of course, somewhat racism tied to it. So again, if black players miss a penalty or that kind of stuff, they will get racist comments from it. In my experience, at least from what I see online, it's maybe not as bad as it is in the UK or in other places, but it this still definitely does happen. So it is also like not as progressive and as maybe loving to everyone as a culture as you would maybe expect if you are very optimistic about the Dutch culture. And another thing is about a lot of regulations. So a lot of things have to happen a specific kind of way, which makes things slow. Things are less impromptu. Things happen very schedulely, which also means that meeting up with people tends to be a bit less, uh, maybe spontaneous, which might be good, might be more fun, and might be a bit more joy bringing into life. And then the last thing, and this is drugs. We are quite a big producer of drugs, especially exporter. And I think the reason for this is one of the big things that we're exporting are things like medical products. So we already have quite some knowledge on how to make drugs. We are also a highly educated population, We have also a lot of access to international markets because we have Rotterdam as the port. So we have access to transport. And also, again, we are within the EU, so it's very easy to transport within the EU as well. So this kind of like context lead to a concoction that is perfect for like a strong drug market and drug production. So things that we produce are things like cocaine, something more like synthetic drugs, so something like LSD, ecstasy, MDMA, that kind of stuff. And then also we produce wheat, where the wheat production actually maybe specifically the export isn't as big as the previous two ones. Then, as you might know, the Netherlands allows for weed, and it's very weird because technically weed is still illegal, but we still do not prosecute it, so we tolerate it. Um, Selling of and owning of weed is kind of legal, but the mass production and distribution is actually not. So if you are a weed shop in the Netherlands, technically you cannot legally buy it from a main importer, which is why the current forms actually still allow um like drugs like associations and organizations to become big because they are the ones selling this and because there's no oversight on this. Like because it's illegal, you can't have controlling factors. There has been tests within specific municipalities to actually allow the production and mass production of this, and it's led to more safety and more benefits and all that kind of stuff. Um, the Netherlands is not unique anymore in this kind of like drug policy. So other nations have already been adapting it. So it's not like the Netherlands is a front runner on drugs policy anymore. And it's not something where we are unique in this. I think interestingly, Germany is actually also looking at the different weed policies and is looking at the Netherlands for what not to do. So it also kind of shows that maybe the perception that you have of the Netherlands being a tolerant and everything's legal, that kind of stuff, technically isn't true. And it also shows you that we are behind in development and actually allowing this kind of stuff. Other kind of like drugs regulation is, again, you're not really allowed to sell a lot of drugs. So drug dealers can get caught and they can get like hurt and they get put in prison and they can get fines and that kind of stuff. But people who have drugs for their own consumption, technically that is allowed, or they are less willing to prosecute this. So this is one of the things where if you have like like one or two MDMA pills with you when you go into a festival, you get caught. It's not big of a deal. But if you get like a full pack of it and you're going to try to sell it at the festival, that is of course more of a big deal. Other things is that drugs can be tested, so you can go to the police or you get somewhere else where you can have the drugs tested, so that you actually know that it's good enough quality. And the kind of policy that you want to do is pragmatic. So the pragmatic in the idea of will try to not limit and curb the amount of people that are going to use drugs. Rather, people who always use drugs will just make sure it happens as safely as you can. So this means that, for example, again, drugs can be tested. You have information campaigns on not trying random pills that you find, all that kind of stuff. And I think this pragmatism has both its positive and its negatives. So the positives is very clearly that if you look at the war on drugs in the US, it has been quite ineffective in actually getting people to stop using drugs because drugs are quite addicting. There are often social, economic, and cultural factors that are playing into why people are using drugs. And once you're kind of in the life of crime and you push it more into the crime side, it becomes harder to get out and means you get more chances of organizations to blackmail you and hold it over your head, or like potentially report you to the police as a threat. This means in the end that you push it harder into illegality. However, if you keep it more soft, this means that you're still able to get individual drug dealers, but you don't create too much fear for too many people, and you're still able to allow your leniency with this. The negatives of this, of course, that more people are using these drugs in the first place. You could argue kind of efficacy, but the other thing as well is that the kind of pragmatism that we have in Netherlands has led to kind of inaction, which is, yeah, the kind of like Dutch government, like Dutch weed policy kind of works, and it's working fine. Like we have shops, and we never able to push out most of the legal stuff, but you don't look actively in more ways to actually solve these issues. Um, and again, maybe also other benefits is that the kind of pragmatism also is allowed for temporary benefits that you could do and temporary policies. So in the 80s in Rotterdam, we had a very big issue with things like hard drugs, like heroin and that kind of stuff. So what they created in Rotterdam is a very specific place where drugs were allowed to be taken. There was police there, but you could just literally just take the drugs there. The police was there, and it was just to see if there was going to take a fight, if there was medical issues, that you could just take it. And this was just basically creating a drugs corner that people could do this in. And that actually has led to overall more safety and more easier rehabilitation, because it also means that this is a direct place that medical professionals and people who are trying to help rehabilitate people are able to contact them there, as well as stopping people from being robbed, stopping people from becoming violent, all of that kind of stuff, and getting to the sign quickly when people overdose. This overall is a very good policy. It doesn't happen anymore because it's not a big issue anymore. This kind of policy pops up time and time again when you have a kind of crisis. But there's also a question of, to what extent is this maybe curing the symptoms rather than maybe dealing with the problem, which stem from who are you allowing to produce and actually get access to and give the drugs in the first place and transport the drugs. And maybe there should be harder stances on that and going for the criminality on that. Maybe in combination with legalizing all drugs or doing all these other policies. Um, or just also just focusing maybe more on that kind of stuff and fighting the different mafias and mobs and like drugs organizations that are profiting from this, that are having organized crime, like syndicates and that kind of stuff, that are profiting from this. So okay, that's the drugs policy in Netherlands. I feel like this has been already a very long workshop. If you have any more questions, put them in the comments. There will also be a Q&A session on Wednesday. There's a form out there that you can use to actually ask questions, and I'll answer that there. And that is everything I wanted to cover for this workshop. I hope this is clear, and good luck with prepping for Euros.